All right, welcome everyone as you log on now or are watching this in the future with our registrants. I think we have a record number of registrations because our book clubs are so excited. I would like to begin by telling you a bit about the Country Bookshop in downtown Southern Pines, North Carolina. We are unique in that we are a bookstore that is part of a small community, twice weekly, award-winning newspaper called The Pilot. We are a general bookstore for kids and adults that is part of a community that chooses to shop with us and share their stories and lives with us and celebrate the people who take a bit of their history and themselves, carve it out on the page, and give us an illuminated vision like the two women who are here with us today. Victoria Christopher Murray is a native of Queens. Victoria from Hampton University and an MBA from New York University. Entrepreneurial venture, a financial services agency for Aegean USA, where she managed the #1 division for 9 consecutive years. Dubbed a Christian fiction writer because no one else was writing about religious topics, Victoria trailblazed the literary scene, penning more than 30 novels, co-writing with other authors, and ghostwriting for top talent across the country. Victoria lives in Washington, D.C., is a jogger, doting grandmother, and member of the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, Incorporated. Marie Benedict is a lawyer with more than 10 years' experience as a litigator. A graduate of Boston University and the Boston University School of Law, she is a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of The Only Woman in the Room, The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, Carnegie's Maid, The Other Einstein, and Lady Clementine. All have been translated into multiple languages, and she lives in Pittsburgh with her family. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Your bookstore sounds awesome. I hope we get to visit it sometime. Listen.
Well, since I hear you're writing another book, maybe we'll make it happen.
We're hopeful.
Can we start by just a quick book pitch, like the 2 sentences, or might be a great way to begin.
Do you want to start? Do you want me to start?
Yeah, because I always say that Marie should start because this whole thing started in Marie's head. So
sweet. I think it started in Belle Costa Greene's, who's our heroines. But so the story is about Belle Costa Greene, who was the personal librarian to the famous financier most people have heard of, J.P. Morgan. And she was brought on to run his world-class collection of priceless manuscripts and early books. During her lifetime, she became really one of the most powerful people in the art world, and certainly one of the most powerful career woman of her day. But she was only able to do that by hiding her true identity. She was actually a Black woman. She was fair enough to pass as white in a very segregated time period. She lived in the early 1900s, and the experiment after the Civil War with equality had failed. And she was really forced to live as white to thrive. That's really the short version of a very fascinating, complex woman and story that we consider really both historic and modern.
You know, it's so interesting in this book, not only the subject matter, but the writing, the type of, I mean, each chapter ended leaving me with such a specific feeling, whether it was just like, oh, Belle, something very exciting that just left me elated, or, taking a pause, and it just felt tighter than so many books. And I was wondering if this was a result of your writing process, or if you could speak to that, or how specifically you did that, or another part of the writing process.
Well, I'd be glad to talk about that because I had done collaborations before, only with one other author, because I don't think you can collaborate with just anyone. I say you really have to have a writing soulmate because your writing partner has to trust you and you have to trust your writing partner. You have to, because you're going to have to say, no, this doesn't work, or we need to do something different, or whatever. You have to know that you're going to do it together well. And so when Marie brought the idea to me through my agent, I knew we could do it because I just had a feeling that the woman who came up with this idea, I wanted to work with her. But you still have to have the chemistry. Yeah. And she had never collaborated. And that's scary, I think, for someone who's never collaborated before, and you don't know the person. At least the person that I had collaborated with before, we knew each other before we started writing together. So I knew it would become a thing where Marie and I would have to trust each other. And from the moment, our first phone call, I said hello, she said hello, and that was it.
Yeah, really.
That was it. And then about 2 conversations in, we were finishing each other's sentences. And by the time we met the editors that were interested in this, the editors were like, so how long have you known each other?
Exactly.
12 minutes? And from that point, we launched this book. And one of the things I am most proud of is I say that Marie and I wrote every word in that book together because we would start out by talking about the chapters, what's coming up, what we need, and we talk it through. Exactly. And then just depending on what chapter it was, one of us would write it and lay the groundwork, and then we'd switch. And we switched a couple of times and went back and forth, and it was just such an amazing process. I remember one time, we did most of our editing through Zoom because it was during the pandemic. But one time, and so most of the time we saw each other every day, but one time Marie called me. And so I knew it was urgent. And she was like,
I couldn't wait for the Zoom.
Yeah, she was like, this whole chapter we've written, I think we need to take it out and do something else. And we talked about it, and I trusted her, and it was a brilliant, brilliant move. And so it was one of the best times I had as a writer.
Me too. Absolutely. For me, I mean, I had been working, in this office. This is my office. This office by myself with my books and my time portal up here. And I really relied on Victoria to help me understand what a collaboration would look like. She had such vast and excellent experience with collaboration. And I knew I could trust her because, as she said, from that very first conversation, it's hard to explain like how we just connected really right from the start. We are in some ways so similar. It's crazy. I mean, the elephant in the room, obviously Victoria's black and I'm white, but aside from that, we're so similar. But we're different in ways that complement each other in terms of a writing partnership. And, we didn't know that at the first, but the deeper we got into it, the clearer it became, as Victoria said, like one of us would lay the track and one of us would fill in, or vice versa, or there would be certain chapters that one of us would feel really strongly about, like one of us really wanted to write the scene in DC, which Victoria handled so beautifully. She did that, such a pivotal part of the book, and she felt really strongly about that. And of course, she took that, and I would love some, I don't know, art scene, because that's like kind of my love. But it was so natural and easy. And but at the core of it all, like Victoria said, was trust. I feel so honored that she felt she could trust me so much to talk about really such tense issues. I mean, we're writing a book about this fantastic woman who lived this astonishing life. I mean, stuff we couldn't possibly make up. And yet it's really a book about race at the same time, because I think what you said, it felt so tense sometimes. Our character was walking on a tightrope constantly. Never sure she was going to be able to pull it off. Never sure she was going to be able, someone was going to recognize and out her. So, in order for us to really get inside her head and inhabit that space, we had to have very sometimes challenging conversations about race, in which, you're really talking about your feelings, your experiences. I mean, the greatest honor Victoria ever bestowed upon me was to trust me with her own experiences and her family's own experiences. And that, deepened our friendship and deepened the Belle's experience in the book as well. So, it wasn't, like a formulaic flow chart. It was definitely more organic than that. But at the core of it all was really trust.
I think it's also interesting that your book finally dropped, y'all's book finally dropped like 2 days before the recent verdict was announced, rolling back voting rights. And this particular moment in American history, I mean, is such a important thing for people to be aware of, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And I want to go back to what that is, back to that original decision Belle's mother made for her and the kids to pass. Like, can you talk to that a little bit?
That's what drew me in, really. And I don't know if Marie will remember this, but in our first conversation, Marie, you were breaking that down for me. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, so when I first kind of came across Belle, she was amazing, right? In her own right. She was this powerful woman at a time when, as Victoria likes to say, women couldn't even vote, right? I mean, she was in such a unique position. And that's really what I do with all my books, is kind of excavate these women who leave these legacies that we may not be aware, that we might be aware of the legacy, but we may not be aware that they're responsible for it. And as I kind of peeled back the initial layers of Belle's life, what struck me was that, here's her father, right? She's raised by these two really incredible parents. Her father, who's a well-known man, Richard T. Greene, first Black graduate of Harvard, brilliant, such a gifted orator. He won all these orator prizes at Harvard. And while he was at one point a professor and dean at the University of South Carolina and a librarian there and the dean of Howard Law School, his real passion was advocating for equality. And he sort of came of age when this, right after the Civil War, 1865, right when Reconstruction was really rolling out, and the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was enacted. And that act, that piece of really groundbreaking legislation, had it stayed, would have guaranteed, would have been the cornerstone of equality for all people, Black and white, in our country. If it had not been overturned by the Supreme Court in the, not even 10 years later, we wouldn't have had segregation. We wouldn't have had Jim Crow laws. We would have had the beginning of the kind of equality that we didn't attempt again until the 1960s with the next Civil Rights Act, right? So we had this, it struck me that we had this moment in time in our country when we could have gotten equality, right? And we really could have set the stage for so many magnificent things. And that's what her father wanted. And that's how Belle was raised. She was raised in this language of equality and the importance of it, and the promise of it. And so was her mother. Her mother came from this free community of color in Washington, D.C. They had been free for generations. They had their own beautiful culture and rituals. And she married Belle's father, and they went to the University of South Carolina during this little period of time when colleges were integrated and her father was a professor. And while they were there, things started to change. And bit by bit, that equality was eroded until, you had sanctioned segregation. And it was at that moment that I'm going to let Victoria take over. She sees me with my crossroads, this juncture when things started to really change and become clear that the promise of equality that her father was fighting for wasn't going to happen, and decisions had to be made.
Yeah, and that's when her mother took over. I like to believe that Genevieve was as active in the civil rights movement as her husband, as far as it would be at that time. It's kind of like Coretta Scott King with Martin Luther King. She was the backbone to him. And I like to believe that she was the same way. But she saw the writing on the wall. She said, this is not going to happen for us. And it was really interesting because Belle was 16 at that time when her mother said, you know what, this is not going to happen. And I think about Belle having 6 years of a different life. 16 years of a different life. She was Black. She was a proud member of the Fleet family. Her father was this great orator, this great educator. She was proud of being a Black woman in this country at that time. But at the age of 16, her mother made another decision for her. And I always think it's so interesting that Belle was 16, because you're too old to forget about what you know. You are who you are already, but you're too young to make the decision of who you're going to go with, your mother or your father. And so the mother just took all the children with her. And one of the things that I'm very proud that I think Marie and I did well in this book is really explain passing, as you were just asking about, Kimberly. Not only what is it, but I think we tried to do a good job with her mother's feelings about it, because it wasn't that her mother wanted to be white. Her mother wanted equality. And there's a difference. She wasn't, if she could have had equality the way they've been fighting for it, that would have been fine. She was proud of being a Fleet. She was proud to be Richard T. Greener's wife. But she couldn't get the equality that she craved for her children unless she pretended to be something that they weren't.
That's exactly right. It was, I think, as Victoria said, like we worked really hard to show the toll that passing took, the sacrifices that had. Yes, there was something to be gained in terms of opportunities in society and education or employment, but there was also a huge cost. And that was something that was, we felt really strongly needed to be depicted. Because that really, that crossroads, that decision, which, Belle sort of, like Victoria said, she was a young person, young enough to know that a change was being made, but not young enough to really bristle against it and say, no, I'm going to take a different path. But that decision, Victoria likes to say, like, she never really left that emotional crossroads. Like that decision, that conflict really stayed with her, stayed with Belle, at least our Belle. For the rest of her life, and that is something I do want to touch on. Belle purposely burned all of her correspondence, period. And we don't have any remaining correspondence that we're aware of in which she talked about how she felt about passing. So she's really our Belle, she's how we would imagine she being as smart and as educated as she was, and being raised, by these two strong, brilliant personalities, and having read her father's writing, just imagining what that might have looked like for her.
The DC scene in the book is so powerful. And it was interesting, y'all giving a little bit of insight into how that was written. And I think that juxtaposition of it is so strong, and I will let our readers discover it on their own, but I think that is a really important place in the book to unpack and discuss around. But there's one phrase that's in there that just, I had to sit back, and I was wondering where these words come from, and but it is thus. And I was wondering about those words, because I was like, those words have been uttered for a long time, and I was wondering if y'all could speak to those words.
Yeah, those were Marie's words. I do want to say something about that scene, though.
Such an important scene.
Remember, I said that you have to trust each other, and that one day Marie called me up and said, "We've got to redo a scene." That was the scene.
Yeah. Well, and explain, two things were happening here at the kind of simultaneous. We were deep in the edits, right? Yeah. And Victoria said to me, she said, I feel like we've made it too easy for Belle. In earlier iterations, she kind of sailed right into this glamorous life, hobnobbing with Vanderbilts. Her life, we couldn't make that stuff up. She was taught to drive by John D. Rockefeller. Her life was just like you think of a celebrity, and it was like, not just a celebrity, but this brilliant, it's mind blowing what her life was really like. and Victoria was right. We just had her sail in. And, we pointed out the stuff about the backdrop and her father and the sacrifice, but we weren't really having her experience those emotionally experience it.
That was our first draft.
That was our first draft. And we weren't, I think we really needed to make plain what those sacrifices looked like. And around that time, I called Victoria. Normally we were on Zoom every morning, right? But that particular day I called her because I couldn't wait for our Zoom time. We'd had, in the editing process, you write and then you wait, for the feedback from your editor. And I'm a crazy researcher. I mean, you should see my office. It's like littered with books. I can't help myself. And I had read, we don't have Belle's letters that describe how she felt about passing, what that was like. But there's wonderful scholarly writing about that. And there's a wonderful book called A Chosen Exile by Allison Hobbs, in which she goes deep into the sacrifices that Black people made when they passed. And it really made us started thinking about, really think about the cost, that toll, in a really tangible way. So, she went into journals and letters and individual experiences with people who passed. And it kind of helped us see maybe what we couldn't see, because Belle didn't want anyone to know she'd been Black, because, she died in 1950. That was still the age of segregation. If people had found out, what might that have done to her legacy? What would it have done to all that she accomplished at the Morgan Library, which we can talk about separately. But anyway, and that book really talked about people leaving their families behind, right? I'm passing, but I can't be with my Black extended family because that'll make clear that I'm Black, right? It made clear that very often women couldn't marry or have children, or men as well, because their children, even though they were fair, their children could be Black. And the whole thing would be revealed. And it where you lived, how you dressed, how you talked, who you associated with, what you read, who you knew, all those things, really, we started to process those together. And that's what we had talked about, maybe even had like sort of a high level Washington, D.C. scene. And after that reading and those conversations, it was actually that phone conversation, Victoria kind of took the lead on that Washington, D.C. scene, which really, I think, puts in bold relief the two different lives that they could have led and the sacrifices that they were making. So I don't know how much you want to give up on it, Victoria. I
think that's good. That's good enough.
Okay.
I'm just so glad, Kimberly, that you pointed out that scene.
Yeah.
Because it was so important to us, and we went back and researched and reworked it totally. And we think the way it is now really explains. But you were saying something about the phrase.
Sorry, we could digress.
Marie.
Well, I've been writing historical fiction for a while. And
she has a magical brush. I call it a magical brush. I don't know where she gets that brush from.
I don't know. It's, after a while you kind of, it's almost like translating. You might think it in modern day dialogue or phraseology, but once you translate it into whatever time period you happen to be, you might say it a different way. But you're right. I mean, that was how it was, whether you were white or Black, that was the way that you were going to operate. And the risks were there. I mean, that was the other thing we really looked at in that scene and tried to heighten at that time, because we were doing a lot of other research. We were really trying to get a handle on what the ramifications might have been to Belle if she'd been found out. It could have been something like losing her job. And if she lost her job, because she'd been discovered to be Black, what would that have done to her family? Her whole family was dependent on her financially, but their white identities were also founded upon her too. So if she was Black, guess what? So were they. And they were married to white people. A whole house of cards was going to come down. But we were also, and I don't know if you want to talk about this as well, Victoria, we were also really looking at what was going on from a racial perspective in our country at that time.
I think that was so, one of the things that we were able to do in that scene and also throughout the book was I've had people who finished the book and they've already emailed me talking about how much they learned. Yeah. And even Black people, it doesn't matter, Black people and white people are saying, I didn't know there were other things besides Tulsa. You just taught me about the Atlanta ones. Who knew, and Marie and I really wanted to dig deep and discover the ones that were there, were that important, had all of these race wars where so many Black people die on the lie of someone telling a lie. But we wanted to uncover the ones that people hadn't heard of. We wanted to show what was going on in the country at that time, and people were lynched for passing, for saying that they were white and then later on being discovered to be Black.
Yeah.
The peppering of the lynchings, it's like, oh, and in the paper there it was, and it's just peppered throughout the book, so you get a sense of the consistency, and that it was always right up there, pressed. I mean, it's
and that's really what my mother reacted to. Her mother did not. I have a hard time believing that she was just, oh, I want to be white. Not when she was almost lynched when they were run out of South Carolina.
Right.
So why would she want to be part of a group that almost lynched her? If she was in fear for her life, but she wanted equality, and so that was the way to get it.
As mothers, we'll do so often anything for our children. And, that was something I think Victorian, I think she probably would not have wanted. It kind of went against her upbringing. It certainly went against sort of everything that Richard T. Greener stood for. But it was the only way really she could see in this increasingly segregated world that her children were going to have opportunities.
Well, and when you look at the height that she scaled, it's really another thing that people get to the opportunity to become engaged with is rare books and the history of writing and printing, which, I mean, y'all are both writers. I'm a bookstore, reading girl, obsessed with that. But I'm so excited for the average reader to really wrap their mind around what she was building and the history of the printing press and just books in general and illuminated manuscripts. And can y'all, what a gift.
That was a gift to me. Yeah. I was so happy to learn that from Marie. I didn't know what to do. There were times when it was hard to write because I would read something that Marie wrote and then I would go digging to learn more, and I spent hours, but then in spending those 6 hours, I found the clue of something that I called Marie and said, guess what I found out? She wore Cuban heels. I mean,
so many, and that's, I mean, if you like to read historical fiction, us as writers of historical fiction, you do because you love to find those bits and pieces, right? You love to understand, what people were wearing, what they were eating. And in the case of Belle and what she was building, I mean, the Morgan Library is, it has a world-class collection of, it's really like a record of the history of the printed word. I mean, the history of, illuminated manuscripts and then building to the Gutenberg Bible, really the first, the very first printed Bible, and then into the history of the printed word. And, like a lot of wealthy collectors of that time period, he wanted to have the best of everything. But what Belle did was she kind of took this hodgepodge collection. I mean, he had these rare manuscripts and Napoleon's snuff box. I mean, crazy stuff, all sorts of little treasures. And she made it cohesive and scholarly and important. And, I think it was those things that really drew me to the Morgan Library in the very first place, decades ago when I first started going there, because you walk, even Victoria and I were fortunate enough to actually be in the Morgan Library on our pub day last week. You feel the reverence of the written word when you're there. And that's really what that whole place is all about. The original Morgan Library, that was the seed kind of that JP Morgan started with, but that's really what Belle made flower. And then she made that collection, which was a private collection. I mean, she was his personal librarian. She was just his private curator, purchaser, advisor, just for him. And she took that collection, which was really just for his pleasure, that library, which was for his pleasure, and whoever he was kind enough to invite to it, she ensured her legacy was making sure it was available to everybody. so that everyone could understand the magnitude of what they had there. And that was the legacy that she was willing to really protect at all costs. You know, she wasn't going to let anybody find out who she was, because at that time period, if it had been found out that a Black woman had actually created that collection, then well, what might have happened to it after that, she didn't know.
One of my questions, and I have so many more to ask that you touched on, but how has the Morgan Library responded to this? You are bringing knowledge, not only in the book, but knowledge of the collection to so many people. It's a Good Morning America pick. You've gotten Library of America, like the Morgan Library is exposed, getting in ways that they have not, I think, been in the past, which is exciting. Yeah. What's their feedback been to y'all as you've?
I'll let Marie, because she's talked to them a lot, but we were there last Tuesday on our release date to do the Good Morning America interview. And I guess he's the head of publicity, or the publicity director, was there because they opened up the library on the day that it was closed for us to come in. So that was wonderful. But as we were taking pictures, he kept running up and putting us, holding up a tote bag of the
right.
library. Can you hold this? Well, yeah.
I've told this story, which Victoria will appreciate, several times. I don't know about you over the past week, but when we got to the Morgan, we were so fortunate. It just was coincidence that we taped the longer Good Morning America segment, which we think will probably air next week. We taped it. We happened to tape it. The best day was on our publication day, which was such a gift for Victoria and I. I mean, here we were. We were hardly able to see each other when we wrote this book, and to be together in the Morgan Library, like it was closed. It was great. We had the run of the place. We kind of went crazy, but we got there, and it was like 97 degrees that day. We were sweating. So the guy that she's talking about was kind of ushered us back to the special elevator and bathroom and everything so we could freshen up. And we got down in the elevator right outside. He stepped out and he turned to us. We don't know this guy, but he turned out to be such a great guy. He looked at us, he goes, "Ladies, this is GMA. It's Good Morning America."
Good Morning America. I mean, he looked at it just like this. The guy was like crazy. He's like, I guess we were just being too, it was 97 degrees. We just wanted to
cool down.
Like,
do you realize?
He says it just like that. You guys gotta get excited.
We're like, we are. Can we just mop our foreheads?
I hadn't worn shoes in 15 months. I was walking around like a toddler. I was walking around in heels like a toddler in my mother's shoes. I had to concentrate on walking. And she kept saying, take smaller steps. You're walking too fast.
It was, honestly, it was hysterical. It was hysterical. It was like a bunch of people who hadn't been out, literally had been out in public for a very long time. Suddenly with like a 15-person, Good Morning America film crew and Deborah Roberts. I mean, it was crazy. It was really crazy. But to answer your question, I think Victoria just said, they're pretty excited. I mean, the Morgan is pretty excited. Good Morning America. So, I mean, I think what's interesting is they had recognized the importance already of really shining the light on Belle's role. And they actually have been working, I think, for the past year on doing a big exhibit about her. It's going to come out in 2024. It takes forever in the museum world to get anything done, but it's a 100-year anniversary celebration. The Morgan went public in 1924. So they want to celebrate it by honoring Belle, right? But we gave this lovely gentleman, I had his name on the tip of my tongue and I can't think of it right now, but he was wonderful. We gave him some tips about what we thought should be happening. Yeah. Like right now,
her office restored because
exactly as it was. It really needs to be. And he was like, "That's a really good idea." We're like, we know that's a good idea. So.
He's like, "That's a good idea. Can you hold this bag in your next picture?"
So it was.
He was wonderful. They were wonderful. They opened up the Morgan on their day off. They let the Good Morning America crew come. And they brought a whole crew, and It was just wonderful.
It was amazing. And don't think that Victoria and I didn't take a few pictures with the personal librarian propped up in various parts around Memorial Day.
We all know about product placement, you know.
Oh, heck yeah. Heck yeah. We had some fun with that. So it was,
you know, you talk about wearing heels and the fashion. Oh my God. And it starts even just her calfskin boots or her skirts hitting the floor. I'm like, oh yeah, she'd be in a long dress. And then as she enters into this world, the fashion is such a key part of the book, and like peacock feathers and Teddy's advice. Can you talk to what it was like to write that or research that, or however you want to highlight the fashion piece?
Research. We were researching, and there were times when Marie and I were like, we should dress up. We have to go someplace and dress up in one of these outfits. But and I'll let Marie talk more about it, but that was it was through fashion that Belle hid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Belle was so smart. I mean, and so nimble, don't you think, Victoria? I mean, she could think on her feet, twist a situation around. And one of her like great gifts was hiding in plain sight and deflection, you know? So she, you know, she didn't have the money that the people she was hobnobbing with to, I mean, these people had, you know, custom made gowns. They would change upwards of 8 times a day. She was wearing the same dress very often that she was wearing to, like, you know, the Vanderbilt's party later that day or to the opera. So she made liberal and flamboyant use of hats and scarves and really used sort of a little bit of outrageous accessories and dress as a way, probably, you know, to not blend in, but to really hide in plain sight. And if you're looking at her plumage, you're not looking at the color of her skin. If you're talking about her hat or the outrageous scarf she's trailing around the room, then maybe you're not going to be gossiping about, because people were gossiping about her dusky complexion. That's what they called it. So, you know, it was both a way of kind of hiding the fact that she didn't have the fanciest clothes, but it was also a way of, you know, it was like a magician's tactic. Look over here, not over here.
Yeah.
I want to ask y'all, and this is a question from one of my colleagues. She was curious why y'all chose for Bernard to be such a focus of the story, for that to be like the big plot arc, because obviously, like, Belle's so amazing, you could hang your hat anywhere on her. Like, what was that decision making?
He was the love of her life. That's a fact. That wasn't the fiction part of it that we had to, you know, we weren't there obviously when they had sex and things, but that he was the love of her life and she was the love of his life. And so it wasn't, we left out there. She had a lot of other lovers.
Yeah.
Just didn't have enough pages to go into all of that. We had to stick to the story. But I think one of the things the reasons he's so important, besides being the love of his life, it shows all of her sacrifices too. Because, you know, she couldn't marry him if he ever wanted a child. She couldn't take that risk because of the complexion, her complexion. She just could not take that risk. So that's why he was a big part of the book. He was a big part of her life. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, definitely. And, you know, I think in some ways she was, I mean, they had an initial attraction, you know, they, on a lot of levels, some probably subconscious, right? They really were both outsiders in their world. I won't say why, I'll let the readers figure out in what way they were outsiders without even really ever articulating it. They knew that about each other. They both had this incredible, they both were such gifted art historians. I mean, they really could see things. Like, he really is the person who almost gave rebirth to the Renaissance, who really explained Renaissance paintings and artwork and manuscripts to this new newly rich American collectors. People didn't really, he taught people how to read a painting, and all of that was so attractive to Belle, you know, to have that. And I think initially there was an attraction, but there was also something captivating about him because he was already married. You know, he wasn't going to ask her to marry him, right? She thought that perhaps this could be her way of having her cake and eat it too, right? She could have this great love, but she couldn't, because she couldn't marry and because she couldn't give a husband or a partner a child, because that might give up her whole ruse. It might be perfect. But then as time went on, and again, I don't want to say too much, you know, there were questions about whether she wanted that with him or not. And, that became complicated. So as Victoria said, he was a huge part of her life, even though she often didn't see him very much. People in that time period, they wrote letters, like they would devote hours every day to writing letters. And so as they were letter writing, they're really communicating with one another. So he's very, even though he's not physically present, he's very present in her life. And so he's a huge part of her emotional life and her business life, right? I mean, she's telling him everything. He's advising her kind of behind the scenes, giving her information, filling in the gaps in her knowledge about the players and the landscape. But then her relationship with him lays bold the sacrifices that she has to make as a woman in the world. So that was really, we wrote it other ways, but that was really Belle's story.
I think Angie just wanted more. She's like a manuscript obsessive, and I will be it'll be interesting for y'all to watch as this goes out, if people start collecting more, you know, start finding those rare books and just being open in different ways. You know, the women's suffrage movement is hammering away, and what I love about the way it's told throughout the story is it's the people. It's the actual people, and what they do. And I have a few questions around that I'm just going to throw out, and then y'all can take it as you run. First of all, you talk about, and you know, Victoria, is part of your bio, you mentioned your sorority, and I know African American like sororities are just a pillar in getting things done and making things happen. And I love, you talk about the 22 young women from Howard University, members of a colored sorority, Delta Sigma Theta, who joined thousands of others in the women's suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., despite the fact that they weren't wanted. And I did want to highlight that as well, and then hand it to y'all.
And that's the reason why I pledged my sorority back in college, because I was doing a report on the women's suffrage and in high school, and I came across this article about these 22 women. But what was so fascinating about it was that they asked if they could participate, and they were told no, because they were colored, they were not needed. And they marched anyway. And when they marched anyway, I was like, oh, that's what I would have done. I would have marched anyway. They marched in the back, and they marched anyway. So Marie's heard this story a million times, because I'm so proud of that. And so it's so funny, because I have friends who are members of the other African-American sororities and fraternities. And they were like, and so I'm getting lots of emails. They're like, yeah, we saw how you snuck that in there. And I was like, no. And I was like, how do you know Marie didn't know to do that? You know? They were like, yeah, we saw how you snuck that line in there, because you say Delta Sigma Theta and then all the other ones. But it wasn't that I snuck that in there, because we wanted to talk about the women's suffrage, because it was such an important part of that time. I'm just always still fascinated. I say this all the time, everywhere. She had all of this power with all of this money, and she couldn't even vote. And so we wanted that to be a big part of the story, and you couldn't tell that part of the story without telling about the 22 women, African-American women from Howard University, who were not wanted in that march, but who marched anyway.
Well, and not only that, it showed, you know, it takes it to another level. Like, not only did women not have the vote, but Belle was actually a Black woman, right? Well, how powerless was she, you know, in this whole context? And yet, as Victoria said, she wielded so much power. It's really hard to, not just in the JP Morgan purse, which she kind of had unfettered access to, but in her expertise and her knowledge. And, you know, if at a certain point in her career, if Belle de Costa Greene kind of blessed an object, it was in. And if she decried it a forgery, it was a forgery. I mean, she wielded enormous power, and she did for many decades. So it was, you know, I think a way to put her accomplishments and legacy really in context against what was actually happening in our country is really important. And you see that actually Victoria has been a historical fiction writer since she was a teenager. You just didn't know it yet.
I didn't know it yet.
Waiting.
Research. It was this little obscure article about those 22 women.
That's exactly what it is. That's historical fiction research, right?
Yeah. And then I found that all these women that I admired were already members of that party. So I was determined.
I would like to invite anyone who is watching us live. I know many of you will watch this later, but if you have a question for any of either of our guests, to type that in the little Q&A thing, that would be preferable, or even the chat, either one. The Q&A would be great, and we will get to those. But while I'm letting y'all formulate your question, you know, do we want to talk about the nuances of passing three colors, black, white, and colored, or the nuances of how y'all wrote being a close employee to a family? Because it's such a delicate balance, and it felt so real, you know, that line of professionalism, family. There's a little bit of hint at romance, but also his children. That just felt so real to me.
Oh, yeah. What do you think, Victoria?
Yeah, I know.
Those are tough choices.
Yeah, this was so interesting because we remember, Marie, we talked about all the different relationships that there were two of them, JP Morgan and Belle Greene, and they had like 6 relationships between the two of them.
They were like friends, wannabe lovers. They had like this very father-child paternal relationship at sometimes, and yet sometimes she was like his confessor. I mean, it was so complicated. And she was in the mix, like his family, like you said, they were in and out of that building constantly. 2 of the sisters, to a lesser extent, but certainly Anne and Jack, his only son, they were like omnipresent in there. And that was, and then she would be invited to like family dinners and birthday parties. And she was like you're right, she was like a quasi family member, but she was also an employee. And he had met her family. You know, it was such a weird, and yet at the core of it all, there's this huge lie, right? I mean, the tightrope that she was walking. And, you know, we have absolutely no real idea, but Victoria and I kind of imagined this very fraught relationship between her and Anne, the unmarried youngest daughter, and her being really the one who would get upset the most at the boundary crossing. You know, she was a little bit jealous of the role that Belle played and how close she was to her dad. And, you know, was she jealous of her as a child, is jealous, you know, of another sibling, or was she jealous of the attention? And then, you know, I don't want to get into too much, but Belle had to protect herself in that relationship because she kind of felt Anne coming for her. And so she used some private information about Anne. And again, that whole scenario is pure fiction, that nature of that relationship. It had been reported and kind of secondhand in letters from the time period that the women were not particularly close, but we layered in that the jealousies and and how Belle might have had to use Anne's sexuality against her.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, also too, we wanted to explore the kind of some of the sexual dynamics that were happening at this time. I mean, we've had several people say to us, like, who would have thought there's Boston marriages, open marriages, there's all sorts of things that you think all the time, especially in the upper classes in the Gilded Age, you know, and Boston marriages are like same-sex relationships, long-term same-sex relationships. So, I mean, really the book kind of has it all, and it's set in a time period where you think those things aren't happening.
Never thought we had to even handle one of those open marriages scenes, you know, where I was like, I wasn't sure what I could do with Belle in that. Oh no.
Wife. I mean, that was really fraught. How would anybody have felt in that situation? And I feel like, I don't know about you, Victoria, but I feel like that gave us the opportunity to explore like Belle's own conflicted feelings about entering into this relationship with Bernard.
Yes, definitely. So,
are you back with us, Kimberly? Okay, good. I think we have audio, video, but maybe not audio. Is that right?
Yeah,
well, there is a question. There is a question. I'm back and I have no idea what's going on, so we'll just move forward.
Quite all right. We've done great.
How long?
We tried to smooth that over.
Name incorrectly. How long did it take you to research and write this book?
Ooh, that's a hard question.
It's been decades in your mind, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about, you know, some of these historical books about historical fiction, like for me anyway, because I collect these women, you know, and I have been for a long time. I write almost exclusively about historical women, and I keep a running list, you know, and it's kind of like when I find them or come across them, and you can come across them anywhere. I mean, it could be a newspaper article, it could be a conversation, it could be a reader. I've often had readers come up to me and say, like, I read about so-and-so, and that person will be on my list. In this case, I first kind of came across Belle when I was many years ago, when I was still a lawyer in New York City. And Victoria's heard this so many times. And I was so just jaded and not happy. I knew that wasn't what my path was meant to be. And I would sneak out. And one of the places I liked to go to was the Morgan Library. I could really kind of envision a different life. I loved history. I loved art. I was thinking about maybe going back to school, getting a PhD or something. And a docent mentioned Belle to me. And I kind of kept her in my mind for all those years, because I didn't know that she was Black and passing at that time, but I knew a powerful woman at that time was really rare. And I knew the Morgan was amazing. And then over the years, I would just kind of dip into a little research. And that was over time, I started to learn more about her background and who she really was. And then her story went from like fascinating to just super, in my mind, super important. But I knew it was not right to write that book on my own, that Belle really deserved to have a black woman tell her story as well. There were two really distinct sides of Belle's life. But it wasn't until I met Victoria, I first read her book, Stand Your Ground, which is wonderful look at a very complicated topic in our society, the shooting of a young Black man. And it tells the story from the perspective of his mother and the wife of the police officer. And I read that book and I was really blown away by it. And I just thought, you know, here's this woman who's really tackling something so hard. And she's looking at it from all these really fresh perspectives, you know, really valid for us to look all around this issue instead of really just one way. And so through my agent, I reached out to her agent and was just hopeful she would want to tell the story with me. And that was that. I had done obviously some research, and I had written a treatment, a couple pages, and maybe a chapter. And that was maybe 2.5 years ago. Would you say, Victoria, at this point?
About 2.5 years ago. And so from the time the deal was announced, it was almost exactly 2 years to the publication of our book. So we've been working on it for a while.
For a long while. A long while. Yeah. I mean, that's why it's so hard to say how long have you been writing it? It's, for a long time.
Yeah, because a lot of writing is thinking.
Yeah, it is.
Just sitting with the character and just letting her wake you up at night. A lot of writing doesn't have anything to do with the writing, but it is the writing.
And in this particular case, so much of the book really came through our conversations, the way we would talk through, not just the historical events, which is sort of the framework of the story, but also how Belle would feel, how the characters would interact, what in her society she would have been aware of, whether it was a socio-political type of thing or a personal thing, and how she would have felt about all of those things.
I want to ask if people are not familiar with Victoria Christopher Murray, what other books would y'all recommend that Victoria's written for our readers?
Well, can I give one? I mean, I definitely think people should read Stand Your Ground. I mean, it's just such a really beautifully written, nuanced look at a really tough issue. It's not historical fiction. It's just if you're interested in important issues, which, really our book is historic, but it's also very modern, a modern look at it's really hard topics. That book takes a modern issue and really looks at it in a really thought-provoking, I think very important way. That would be my for readers of this particular book. But Victoria's written so many great books, and many of them have been turned into movies recently. Just this past weekend, right, Victoria?
Not many.
I consider too many, and there's more on the way. So that equals many.
Only a sister takes the number 2 and turns it into many.
To me, I'm very proud of your movies, so I can say many.
So I've been writing the 7 Deadly Sins. Oh, by the way, what Marie said, Stand Your Ground is my favorite book because I thought I love writing novels. I want to make it up. I don't want to write nonfiction and a whole bunch of facts, but I love fiction that's based on fact, which is why I'm now in love with historical fiction. Just with writing with Marie. So that's my most important one. But then, I write those other books too that end up on Lifetime.
They're awesome too. And I mean, the movies are great too, but you have to read the books.
Yeah, so I am writing the 7 Deadly Sins series. And so I've written Less Than Envy, and those both were on Lifetime. And now I've also written Greed and Wrath, and those are going to be produced for Lifetime as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a lot of movies.
No,
right? That's why I said many. That's very reasonable.
Being made now. We're in the process, the pre-production.
Very reasonable. I'm just saying. It's many.
As a last question, Denise is asking who y'all's next book is about and how soon will that be available, because they're big fans of y'all's collaboration out here.
Yeah,
too. We're fans of it too. Do you want to tell about that one?
I always get to tell. You tell. Because I always get to tell.
I love it. It's going to be such, I'm really looking just for it. It's going to be written a little bit differently, but really it's going to be so wonderful and lead to so many, we hope, really important conversations and just thinking about these issues. So it's the story of the friendship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary Mcleod Bethune. Mary Mcleod Bethune founded Bethune-Cookman College in Florida, but she was also one of the very first women in a senior administrative role in the White House, in this case under FDR. But she and Eleanor became friends while he was still governor of New York. And together, these women, I mean, there was a lot of resistance to a Black and a white woman becoming good friends at that time. And these two women in some ways, they're so different, but so similar. And they came together and forged this incredible trust and friendship and bond. And I think together really started to move the needle in equal rights. And so I think they left a huge legacy. But we're going to have so much fun writing it.
And I'm so excited to write this because
so fun.
A lot of, we have the two sides of Belle. And while Marie always says she couldn't write the book without me. It could not be written without her, because Belle lived as a white woman and she was Black. So she needed both of us. But what I'm so excited about with Eleanor and Mary is that I kind of see Marie and I in their friendship. I think of Eleanor as like the first ally. I could almost see like they came up with those words, you know, because Marie is such an ally. I mean, like she's such an ally. Like I would have to step in front of her to stop her from beating up somebody who's coming after me.
It happens. I'm so secretly strong. You know?
I'm not even kidding. And I just see so much of Marie and the blessing I have that she loves me. I see so much of that in Eleanor with Mary, vice versa. And so I'm so excited because I think so much of our friendship is going to end up
be on the page. I do too. And I think, you know, Victoria and I talk a lot about how the fact that we think so many problems in terms of modern day racial relations between people is because people don't have uncomfortable conversations. I mean, you know, they are so fearful of saying the wrong thing that they just don't say anything at all. And so the people stay polarized, they stay separate, they stay apart rather than being together. And, you know, we love the idea of people coming together to talk about the personal librarian, to talk about this book tentatively is called The First Ladies, or any other book in between, because, you know, it's in conversations that we grow together and we can see the world through other people's eyes. You know, the greatest thing about, from my perspective, about the personal librarian is my friendship with Victoria, and that you know, she gave me the gift of trusting me and talking to me about things that were really very uncomfortable to talk about. I mean, when you're writing a book about race, you have to talk about all those things.
And it's when we wrote it. One thing we didn't discuss today was that we did the hard part of this, the editing, the rewritings, the adding of the scenes, the really layering of the book. Yeah. We did it at the pandemic had just hit. So we were stuck in our homes and grateful for Zoom, because we talked every single day for like 3 hours. Yeah. And then we did it in the middle of the summer when the social unrest, you know, after watching what happened in Minnesota. And it was interesting because Marie would check on me every day just to see where I was, but just as many days I had to check on her.
Yeah, it was so exciting.
That's why I say what I say when, she's such an ally, because there were days when I had to pull her back from the cliff.
Well, I couldn't help it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And, you know, once you start to look at the world through, you know, once I started to look at the world through Victoria's eyes, I couldn't stop looking at the world that way. And I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And your sense of protectivism and wanting to help, wanting to be an ally in whatever way you can, really kind of, for me, it really rose up. But it's that kind of relationship that we're so excited to explore in this.
I think Ellen and Mary had the same. I think they may have
very similar.
First popular, you know.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just excited about it.
Yeah, it's going to be, and hopefully kind of, good for other people to read as well and experience along with them.
And everything that Eleanor had to go through, because she wanted to befriend a Black woman. And Mary, who was the 15th child, she was the first child that was not born into slavery.
Mm-hmm. In her family. Can you believe that? 15.
In her family. And she just believed in education from the time she came out of the womb.
Right.
Her and her mother just believed, but her mother just wanted her to be able to read the Bible to her and believed in it. And so they came from so totally different backgrounds to just becoming these friends who helped to make some major changes.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to lock y'all in for an in-person author event for this next book. We're going to have Black book clubs. We're going to have white book clubs. We're going to all be together.
We would love that.
That's our big thing.
That is our thing.
We want to bring Black book clubs and white book clubs together, just like we came together.
Do it. We're going to do it at the country bookshop.
Consider it done. We will accept your
invitation. We have been saying that's what we wanted
this whole time.
I'll start chipping away at it now. So
yes.
Oh, so good. I'll be ready. I'll start talking and
that is
pulling
awesome.
Everybody in.
That's our dream, really.
That's our dream, because
really
when you read the same book through different eyes, you're going to learn something.
Oh yeah. I mean, we even wrote some of the questions, the reader's guide at the back, with an eye to different sorts of responses. And if you could get people together to talk about that, it would just be so important, I think.
It's what books can do.
Yeah.
That other things can't too.
Exactly. It can bring people together in a way that maybe even talking about their own experiences sometimes is hard. But when you come together to talk about these characters that you feel close to, that you feel you can come together. That little bit of distance helps bring people together, I think.
Well, and when you're reading, you're actually in someone's head. Like when you're watching a movie, when you're standing next to someone, you're not in someone's head, but in a book, you're living whoever you're reading in that moment. And it's really special. Well, I could keep chatting with you guys forever. And now that I know that we'll see you in a couple of years for this extraordinary thing that I'm going to pull off, because y'all are going to write the book. But if anyone here needs a copy of The Personal Librarian, come to the Country Bookshop. You can get it online at the Country Bookshop. We deliver. And I just want to thank the two of y'all for writing this book, for sharing Belle's story, but also for being so generous with the Country Bookshop with your time today, and also just for y'all's friendship. It just billows off the screen and the page. So
that's like the best compliment.
That is the best compliment. Because people to know how much I love this lady.
Oh, it's so mutual. I'll do it for you too. I always end our together. I'm giving her a hug.
I'm just gonna go like this. Good morning, America. Good morning, America.
Good morning, America. Like we didn't know.
We were just standing there looking at each other. I was just trying to figure out how to walk in my heels.
Actually, I think he helped us practice after that. It was so funny. I mean, that was a moment we will never forget.
Never.
Well,
thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Thanks so much.
We'll see you soon.
Yeah, it'll be great.
See you soon.
Bye, guys.